What was to happen to Israel's fields every seventh year? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Leviticus on walking through the Bible. If you have a Bible with you, turn to Leviticus 25. We're going to be reading from verses 1 to 7. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Leviticus 25, beginning at verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, When you come into the land which I give you, then the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard, and gather its fruit. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. What grows of its own accord of your harvest you shall not reap, nor gather the grapes of your untended vine. For it is a year of rest for the land. And the Sabbath produce of the land shall be food for you. For you, your male and your female servants, your hired men, and the stranger who dwells with you, for your livestock and the beasts that are in your land, all its produce shall be for food. After taking a short detour, we again return to the main topic of section 4, which is feast days and seasons. What we have being described for us here in the first 7 verses is what is known as the Sabbath of the land of the Lord. Now, as we've studied through the Old Testament, we have become quite familiar with the Sabbath day, the 7th day of the week, or what we would call Saturday. We understand that the Israelites were commanded to do no work on this day, nor even prepare food. This was to be done on the 6th day of the week, the day of preparation for the Sabbath. What we're given here is a different type of Sabbath. This Sabbath was for the land. What God was saying here is that once they came into the land, that for 6 years they would sow and harvest their fields, following other types of restrictions found earlier in Leviticus. However, during the 7th year, they were not to sow their field, prune their vineyard, nor gather fruit, for in the 7th year the land was to have a year of rest to the Lord. We've seen this instruction before in Exodus 23, 10 and 11, which said, 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its produce. But the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the beasts of the field may eat. In like manner you shall do with your vineyard and your olive grove. Purely from an agricultural standpoint, allowing the soil to rest from working means that the soil can replenish its nutrients, thus actually producing stronger and more bountiful crops. But as we've said in numerous places, even though there might be an underlying physical reason for God's laws here in Leviticus, there are some spiritual lessons for Israel to learn as well. The first lesson is that the earth ultimately belongs to God. Yes, God gave man the responsibility of tending the earth and gaining from its fruit, but God created the earth and therefore could make laws concerning it. The second lesson is that God is holy, separate from the nations round about Israel, and therefore Israel was to be holy too. I have read of no other nation doing what Israel was told to do here, or at least for the same reason. And so part of Israel being holy was to abide by this command. The third lesson, though, is perhaps the most difficult for Israel to put into practice, which is that this law required them to be dependent on God for their food in that 7th year, throughout much of the 8th year too. Man likes to think of himself as independent, needing nothing from anyone, but especially when it comes to God, mankind needs to rid himself of this attitude. Without God's grace, without Jesus' sacrifice, we could not get to heaven. We can't buy our way in, barter our way in, or sneak in. We are dependent on God. And unless we realize this, we will never have the humility to obey God in the first place. Bringing it to Israel required faith and trust in God that he would provide for them during this Sabbath year of rest for the land, something that God will explain later on in this chapter. Perhaps this lack of trust is the reason why Israel didn't generally keep this command. For in 2 Chronicles 36, 20 and 21, we read, And those who escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, where they became servants to him and his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. As long as she lay desolate, she kept her Sabbaths to fulfill 70 years. If Israel wasn't to sow or harvest during this year, what was to happen to the land? It was to be allowed to grow whatever came up naturally. And unlike in normal years, when fruit from the land belonged to the landowner, such was not true during the 7th year, for this would be communal food, especially for the poor and for the animals to partake of. Other provisions for Israel during this year, again, will be dealt with later on in this chapter. Just before we close, it is interesting to note that this chapter does play a role in something that exists even to this day. Have you ever heard of taking a sabbatical? The idea of sabbatical comes from this chapter. In academia, a professor typically takes a sabbatical once every 7 years in order to focus on other things. At least his employer allows him to do that if he wants to. It just goes to show us that studying Leviticus can even help us understand things that happen in secular life. With that, our time is up for today. Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Leviticus 25, verses 8 to 17, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.